everybody. Just so you know, you're in the right place. We're at the panel, Using Housing Policy to Expand Access to Neighborhoods of Opportunity. We have a great panel. Starting right next to me, we have Demetria McCain, who's the Vice President and Deputy Director for the Inclusive Communities Project, which I'm sure you've all heard of, especially in light of the Supreme Court decision this summer. She oversees the Mobility Assistance Program at ICP, amongst a bunch of other things. Next, we have Carol Galante, who is the I. Donald Turner Distinguished Professor in Affordable Housing and Urban Policy. That's at Berkeley. She also served as an assistant secretary in HUD, and before that, she was the head of Bridge, which is the largest nonprofit developer of affordable and mixed income housing in the US, I believe? In California. Okay, sorry. Next to her, we have Phil Tegeler, the executive director of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council. I know him because he has a lot of wonderful stats at his fingertips, so if you ever need those, go to Phil. And then lastly, we have Barbara Sard, who is the vice president for housing policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and she was a former senior advisor on rental assistance to HUD Secretary Sean Donovan, who we saw this morning. So we had some really interesting discussions this morning, and I think they all pointed to the idea that it really matters where you live and where you grow up, and the idea that mobility can really be very effective in helping families achieve better outcomes, whether it be health outcomes, educational outcomes, et cetera. So this panel is going to talk about how do we make mobility happen. We're going to just jump right into it. My first question is going to be for Demetria, who has done a lot of really interesting work with ICP. And I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about how ICP came about and what you found has been effective in encouraging mobility in the Dallas area.
Okay. Much like the Gautreaux case that was mentioned earlier, there's a case called Walker that occurred in Dallas, a public housing discrimination case filed back in 1985 by Mike Daniel and Elizabeth Julian. And one of the many remedies from that resulted in something called Walker settlement vouchers through the court and through HUD, Dallas Housing Authority, City of Dallas, et cetera, were defendants in that case. So there's a plethora of remedies. The Walker Settlement Voucher being one, and the creation of a nonprofit fair housing organization being another, as well as some funds from the City of Dallas who through the settlement process, put a pot of money aside to actually help the plaintiffs who ended up being a class. The original plaintiffs were 8 black women who were participants of or on the waiting list of the Dallas Housing Authority's program. And then that turned into a class through that case. So ICP's been up and running for 10 years. We run a mobility assistance program. Initially, our focus was making sure that those Walker Settlement Voucher families, of which originally there were 3,000 Walker Settlement Vouchers on the street, ensuring that they were able to make subsequent moves and remain in opportunity areas. Their first moves, by definition of a court, had to be to a Walker target area, which was defined by the court as it related to poverty, the presence of public housing, and the population, a black population. So we kind of stepped in after those initial vouchers had already been given out. That mobility, the original mobility was done by the Housing Authority through its HOP program. But that support was not there for families who were making subsequent moves with those type of vouchers. So that kind of gives you kind of the background of how we started. What we do now is our approach really is related to barriers. Whenever there's a barrier, you try to figure out how do we overcome that barrier. So some of the things that we've tried, things we've tried maybe 8 years ago, we don't do now. And we're trying new things all the time. But since the small area FMRs came online, our target population that we help has increased tremendously. So the Dallas Housing Authority has about 16,000 vouchers. So those Walker settlement vouchers made up between 2,000 to 3,000. So there's a whole bunch of people with housing settlement vouchers. So once small area FMRs came online, according to Marianne Russ from the Dallas Housing Authority back in 2014, she said that they saw about 5,000 housing choice voucher holders move to greater opportunity types of neighborhoods. And so now we work with both Walker Settlement Voucher holders and Housing Choice Voucher holders.
I'm just going to say, if you...
She's shutting those people who talk too much down.
I'm sure all of you know this small area FMR is small area fair market rent, which is something that HUD is piloting in a few areas, including Dallas. So I'm hoping you can talk through, you have a Walker voucher. How does ICP help people figure out what to do next? How do they determine where's a good place to move? How do you talk to people about mobility and why moving might be a good idea?
Sure. Well, our definition of high opportunity is different from what the court required. We have 6 counselors. Our counselors are given the first 15 minutes of a briefing. If you have a housing choice voucher and you want to move, you have to go sit through about a 2-hour briefing that tells you all the administrative things you have to do to move with your voucher, even though you've already had a voucher for umpteen years. But we're given the first 15 minutes, and that's when our counselors go out and talk about some of the things that are on folks' mind, like schools, what's out there. And it's really important because we talk about the voucher program being about choice, but if you don't know what exists, that limits your choice, right? So it's about informed choice at that stage. So many families don't even know the names of some of the suburbs where they can move. Because of the Walker case, Dallas Housing Authority voucher holders may move anywhere within Dallas County, as well as the 6 adjacent counties. So we're talking about a 7-county region where families with Dallas Housing Choice vouchers may move. So they tell them about where they can move, the extent of geographically. We talk about some of the tools we've created, like we've created a website that gives people the HUD Opportunity Index, gives people the CDFI distress index. There's a map that you can see where the grocery stores are located if you type in the address of a unit that you're considering of moving to. And so those are the type of things. We also do a lot with maps. It's really important. And people even see information about where they currently live. Now, they already know that they might be in a high poverty, high crime neighborhood. But when they see it, that kind of makes somewhat of an impact on them. For instance, the city of Dallas's police department, along with the Dallas Morning News, put something on their website, a tool on their website, interactive tool, showing where the hot spots are. Well, we decided to map that as it relates to where the low-income housing tax credit units were, and they squarely correlated, same neighborhoods. So as people are searching, that's the type of information that we give them so they can make that informed choice. If they're interested after they hear our little spiel, they can sign up and ask for our help, and then our counselors would talk to them and counsel them one-on-one once they're back at the office.
And so the counselors would provide a list of developments in the various suburbs or other areas that accept the vouchers?
We try to stay away from just providing just a blank list because these are hot markets that we're talking about, and so a unit might not be available. So it's really about actually talking to that particular counselor at that moment in time. We certainly know there are about 4 tax credit developments that have come online in the last 3 years or are coming online in high opportunity neighborhoods that we'll tell them about. But these are really, really hot markets that we're talking about. So just handing somebody a list doesn't really cut it.
Got it. So that's one approach, a lot of counseling and providing people information. I want to go to Phil next, who I know has worked a lot with the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program and some of the work that Stephanie DeLuca is doing there. Ask you what you've seen there, what works, what's effective in talking about mobility and getting people to consider to move.
Okay, well, I want to preface this by saying I'm just a lowly board member of the Baltimore program. The executive directors in the audience and the original attorney in the case that created the mobility program is sitting in the front table, so I will tread carefully. The Baltimore program is in many ways the leading program in the country, along with Dallas and Chicago, in terms of the numbers of families and the effectiveness of the moves in terms of getting families from really high poverty neighborhoods to low poverty neighborhoods. I think the data I wrote down in this is the average pre-move neighborhood for the Baltimore program was 30% plus in terms of poverty rate, and the average post-move neighborhood is about 8.1% poverty rate, a really dramatic change. And that's, and Baltimore, you noticed, was on the bottom of many of Professor Chetty's lists that we projected earlier. And this is really based on program design. There's, opportunity mapping of the region. Originally, it was a race and poverty map, and that was shifted over to multifaceted opportunity map. Interestingly, the map looks very much the same, but it's important to have a more nuanced map of the region. We have very robust exception payment standards that function like small area FMRs to make sure families have a fair shot at all of the communities in the region, especially those communities with really high-performing elementary schools. There's regional administration of vouchers, so there's no need to do portability to cross jurisdictional lines, which hampers housing mobility in many parts of the country.
How big are those regions? Is it
it's a 5-6 county region. It's basically the entire metropolitan Baltimore housing market. And also a couple unique features to Baltimore. I think we have pretty intensive geographic targeting. For the first 2 years, families are restricted to stay in the initial target community they move to. This is a power that Baltimore has because it's what's called a moving to work jurisdiction. They can bend some of the regular HUD rules and have geographic restrictions. But it's also been, I think, one of the keys to retention. You know, the families who move to opportunity areas tend to stay in these lower poverty suburban jurisdictions over a long period of time. And another important feature is that in July of 2014, long before Professor Chetty's research came out, but we had a premonition about this, we adopted a policy giving a local preference for admission into the program for families with young children, actually families under the age of 8. And since that time, 95% of families coming off the wait list have been those families with young children, which has led to, really targeting the kids who need it most and getting them into safer communities with really high-performing elementary schools. And I think those are some keys. And the programs in Chicago, Baltimore, and Dallas have been operating for some time, and I think we've learned a lot from these programs, and we know what works. And we know this kind of intensive housing counseling that Demetria talked about, combined with some of these other program features, is actually effective in getting housing mobility to scale. We're really talking about getting to scale, especially, I think, in Baltimore. I think that the data is, I think we have almost 6,000 families with young children in high-poverty neighborhoods in Baltimore. And the program now in Baltimore is at 3,000 families, and it's going up to 4,500 families. That's really moving a very high proportion of families who want to make voluntary moves out of high-poverty neighborhoods. That's operating at scale and at about $3,200 per family. For those kind of transformative moves, I think it's a bargain.
We've talked mostly about the families themselves, whether it be intensive counseling or expanding the area you can use vouchers. I want to talk a little bit about landlords and getting landlords on board with this. So maybe, Carol, maybe you can talk about this a little bit in terms of encouraging mobility. How can we get landlords involved or kind of on board with accepting vouchers?
Sure. Well, I think one important way is to create, and I think Chetty was saying this in terms of some of the policies to be looked at, which is providing financial incentives for landlords to participate. And I think of this mostly from a developer standpoint as opposed to a pure landlord standpoint, but going all the way back to helping finance mixed income developments in high opportunity neighborhoods. There are things that, through the Community Reinvestment Act, you can get banks to perhaps lower their interest rates on a mixed income development that if they agree to accept vouchers. I know, HUD, FHA, multifamily can do that. Fannie or Freddie could do that. Those are ways of getting the financing going as an incentive for landlords. And in fact, in the Thompson case in Baltimore, FHA actually agreed to give a number of incentives for FHA multifamily financing for developers that were agreeing to build in high opportunity areas.
Great. Now, we've been talking a lot about vouchers, but there are a lot of ways to kind of encourage mobility or allow or encourage families to move to higher opportunity areas. And so I want to talk a little bit about the role of the government, the federal and government and local housing authorities in encouraging mobility. So Barbara, I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about that, especially in light of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule released this summer, which kind of says you guys have to do this, or you really should do this. What can HUD or the government do to encourage mobility?
So thanks, Alana, and I want to put this in what you've heard about Dallas and Baltimore in some perspective, because I think it's part of the answer to this question. These are two programs with a lot of years of experience, and I think Demetria made the point that they've learned over the course of time, even though it would be nice to have had more research about that, just from experience and following your own data on what works. And it's important to hold up that example because while you may be reaching scale in Dallas and Baltimore on this, this is the exception, not the rule. In our latest analysis of 2014 HUD data, only 14% of the families with children that receive vouchers live in low-poverty neighborhoods, and 280,000 children in families with vouchers live in neighborhoods where the poverty rate is 40% or more, extreme poverty. So we've got a lot of work to do. Dallas and Baltimore, in my view, share three key features that need to be regulated. These are kind of three buckets. A commitment to achieving the goal of enabling families to use vouchers in high opportunity areas, a policy platform that makes it possible. You've heard people mention sufficiently high voucher payment standards, things that I know these programs share that they didn't get to mention, lists of available units in high opportunity areas, enough time to search in areas where landlords might be fewer and far between who are willing to rent to voucher holders. And you heard about the ability to move to suburban areas without additional hurdles. And third, those programs have additional funds to do this work. To support the staff, to bring new landlords into the program, to help families pay for security deposits, the cost of moving, and to assist families to understanding the choices that they could make. So how do you take those three buckets and think about what HUD can do? Take them in order. To help create commitment, HUD needs to change the incentives that agencies face. And I think where the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule can really play a big role in that, or at least I hope so. But data alone can only go so far. It creates the opportunity for introspection and a conversation. It doesn't necessarily create the will or show the way. And HUD has a lot more to do, I think, in terms of providing effective guidance to agencies about how to analyze policy barriers, both within the voucher program and in the larger housing market, as Carol mentioned, and what can be done. But HUD also needs to further develop other policies. And Raj's talk this morning, I think, laid out some of these ideas. It's pretty, taken for granted that if you want results, you pay for them and you reward them in multiple ways. And that is what needs to be done on the location issue in terms of housing vouchers. And it's both about payment in money, additional administrative fees that HUD could do, and also a higher performance rating, which is based on a rule that basically has not been changed in 17 years. And the policy platform is another place where HUD policy can make a big difference. We don't have time to go through the whole list. There is a handout in your folder that kind of puts these ideas together. You've heard a lot about small area FMRs, but they're only in effect now in 6 areas in the country. And HUD put out sort of a question for the public, an advance notice of proposed rulemaking a while ago, asking for people's thoughts about it, but it hasn't moved past that point. And it's really important to see that policy effort completed.
I just wanted to follow up with Phil because I know in the readings for before the conference, which I'm sure everyone read, all of them, Phil had a piece in there about the pay-for-success model and how it could be used in mobility. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, how you see that working?
Sure, I'll talk about that, but I want to just mention the one big thing that HUD and Congress are not doing, that were not on Barbara's list. You know, I mentioned these 3 large programs in Baltimore, Chicago, and Dallas, relatively large. You know, they are 3 of only 21 programs currently in the country, housing mobility programs. The others, with a couple exceptions, are all very small, just a handful of families. And that's because there is no funding coming from HUD to support housing mobility. There's been much ink spilled in academic journals about the 5,000 families in MTO. But the academic literature on MTO is enormous compared to the actual number of families who are experiencing mobility in this country. I think in Doug Massey's new list of hyper-segregated communities in 2010, I noticed only 2 of those hyper-segregated metros have functioning mobility programs. It's just, it's outrageous that we have this policy and practice. We know how to do it, and HUD and Congress are not providing any money for this. There's no balance in that policy. So I think that's the most important thing, is to get some federal funding to support more of these programs in our most segregated metro areas. The paper we did on using health savings and Medicaid to pay for housing mobility was in part based on sort of the desperation of, we're not getting any federal money for this basic civil rights and family success policy. And the idea basically was using the very powerful MTO data on the health benefits for families who move to low poverty areas. We took the projected health savings only from the health savings from the improvements in diabetes outcomes and obesity outcomes. We didn't even include the mental health or asthma data. Just from those 2 health improvements alone, we projected cost savings that would pay for a typical housing mobility program after 7 to 8 years using Medicaid savings. That's a longer time frame than Sean Donovan usually talks about when he talks about pay for success. But we're looking to, in our efforts to kind of seed more of these programs around the country, that's one of the tools we're trying to use. But we'd much prefer to have direct funding from the federal government someday.
Well, let me ask about that, and I'm going to ask you this. Do we need money for mobility programs, or do we merely, and I know merely is perhaps not the word, but need collaboration from local housing authorities to allow portability? I mean, from your perspective, is it necessary to have, or is it essential to have specific funding for mobility, or is this something that can be done, as part of a local housing authority?
Well, I'll tell you, when your first question was, what are some of the tools or things that we've done to make the moves that we've helped facilitate. I didn't get a chance to talk about that. We provide security deposits and application fee assistance. I think it was hinted at earlier this morning. While small area FMRs help families pay the rent once they found a unit, a lot of times, a lot of those types of neighborhoods have significantly higher security deposits, significantly higher application fees, or you're going to have to apply to more places than usual if you're looking in a high opportunity type of neighborhood. So all that comes with dollars. The Walker Charitable Trust Fund that we use, right now we've been focused on Dallas Housing Authority voucher holders, but we get calls, and we're now looking at trying to, on some level, find some relief for all of the families who have vouchers from local housing authorities that are not the Dallas Housing Authority. But of course, that takes resources. It takes resources in staffing. It takes resources in helping those families access the type of security deposit and application fee assistance they need to get where they'd like to go. Unfortunately, their voucher's not from the Dallas Housing Authority, so they don't get all the bells and whistles that we're able to provide Dallas Housing Authority voucher holders. But I got to make this point as we talk about going to scale. I mean, our demand for our services and our demand for units in high opportunity areas is tremendous, and it's growing all the time. So we have got to do some of the policy work that Barbara mentioned. HUD's got to look at all of its programs. In the state of Texas, we are always top of the list sometimes in some of the bad measures. Our state legislature just passed a statute saying it is illegal for any city to pass a source of income protection ordinance, right? All right, so that's why the tax credit program is so important, right? Because tax credit projects have to take the voucher. But guess what? HUD 22D4 projects don't have to take vouchers. And guess what? There are some in high opportunity areas that don't take vouchers. So we've got to also deal with the supply side of stuff as we look at our policies.
Can I jump in on the D4 issue and the voucher issue? Yeah, the D4. It's like a shoe size. No, so the FHA multifamily financing program, essentially for purely private development, doesn't have real income restrictions on the units. It has a loan limit for the actual project, but more broadly than that, the issue of private landlords taking vouchers. And one of the challenges is we want to get to mixed income developments, and we want them to stay mixed income developments. And so I do think there is a conversation that we all need to have on this mobility question about maybe you incent developers to take a portion of vouchers, but the flip side is that you don't demand that you take one, take all, meaning that 100% of the project could go voucher. And I think that's a real challenge for communities, and it's a real challenge for developers. And I think it should be a real issue for us in terms of creating that kind of integration.
Are there places that you can name that have had incentives like that have been effective and that have worked in the long term?
So I think that the most effective thing that I've seen, and that I've built lots and lots of affordable housing units in high opportunity neighborhoods, and the biggest incentive really was a strong inclusionary zoning ordinance that got a piece of land essentially dedicated from a private development interest that was going to do market rate housing, and their requirement, literally they could not get their building permit without also showing that they're going to provide affordable housing, and doing that through a partnership where they literally donated a piece of land and you used low-income housing tax credits to build the development. And this happens all over California with strong, cities with strong inclusionary zoning ordinances. And then you can add on to that working with your local housing authority to do some project-based vouchers. So you've got a, extremely low income to low income adjacent and in the same school district as people who have $1 million houses. I mean, that is happening on a regular basis. The other thing that will help, and that certainly helped in California when they had it, is points in the qualified allocation plan for low-income housing tax credits that says you get kind of equal points if you're doing community revitalization, and you get equal points if you're doing something called balanced communities, which is, this kind of mixed income housing in, high opportunity places. The last thing I would say is, you have to have these incentives and carrots, but at the end of the day, the mandate that ye shall, as a community, have 10% of your housing that's affordable, as an example, like Massachusetts 40B, allows developers to essentially sidestep the planning approvals process if their community doesn't have that. California has something called the California Housing Accountability Act, which if the property is zoned, say, for 100 units of housing, and you propose it as affordable, the city cannot deny that development unless you're asking for some kind of variance. So it's a limited tool. It's not as good as 40B in my mind, but having some accountability for communities actually, doing a fair share is, at the end of the day, it takes all the lawyers in the room to, make those things happen.
Barbara, did you want to add?
Right. And so I think what people have been raising, are some of the roles for state and local governments, which Sean Donovan touched on this morning, and I know there are a lot of state advocates in the room, and this is really important. I mean, federal policy needs to play a larger role, but can't succeed on its own. The control of land, where properties are built, where rental housing is located, whether that rental housing has to accept vouchers, whether an inclusionary zoning process reaches people who need help paying the rent and can't just pay it on their own. Those are all questions that local and state laws need to resolve. And, you know, honestly, part of my goal for this conference is to spread the awareness that this is not just a housing issue. This is an anti-poverty issue that can reach and needs a much broader coalition at the state level. And I don't ever really want to disagree with the people up on this panel, but I think
it's happened before.
We don't want to do that laundry in public. It will be a big challenge to get the federal government to put a lot more dollars into helping families move to higher opportunity neighborhoods. So I think we need to push for that, and I certainly hope to see the administration seek some funds in that regard in 2017. But there's a lot that can also be done at the state and local level to help with security deposit programs, et cetera, not only governments, but philanthropy. When you think about all of the philanthropic investments in neighborhood-focused programs, thinking about helping people move as a neighborhood-focused program, I think it is also really important.
Can I add one other place where philanthropy, I think, could help, or local government could help is, and I just go back to, because I've got, you know, a lot of scars from NIMBY battles. I used to spend, you know, 3 nights a week out at various city council meetings getting these developments approved, actually funding the kind of advocacy that is not policy advocacy. I'm not talking about people going out and advocating for rent control and, you know, this, that, and the other thing. No, I'm talking about boots on the ground from the community, the faith-based community, to help these developments get built. And, you know, it's takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and, you know, people who are really from the community, who organize and go out there and advocate for the developments, give their local council people cover, and it's, you know, it's very hard to get those kind of folks organized with, you know, no assistance whatsoever. And I think it's starting to happen in many more communities, but I think support of that from philanthropy and others would be a good thing to do.
Phil, did you have something you wanted to add?
I wanted to add something to what Carol was saying about development, but also wanted to add to what Barbara was saying about what states can do. And I wanted to point out, I should have said there are 22 housing mobility programs in the country now, because the state of New Jersey just funded a new housing mobility program there as part of the disaster relief settlement, which is a very new development. And Connecticut, I know, has state funding for housing mobility, and that's something that can happen in a lot of state budgets, and especially in the states that are willing to do it. And states are doing other things too. The Virginia and Illinois, I think, have tax credits for small landlords who want to rent to voucher holders.
But I'm sorry, Phil, I'm gonna jump in. But also, you can look at, like, on the local level, how the municipalities use their federal funds, how they use their CDBG funding.
Well, and that's a very good point. Localities can fund this too. But I want to also, I think your development ideas, that was a great catalog, Carol. And one of the additional sort of good things that's come out of this long multi-year lead up to the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule is that many of us in the civil rights community have started to really engage with folks in the affordable housing and community development field. You know, groups like Enterprise and National Housing Trust, National Housing Conference, Housing Partnership Network, et cetera. You know, the kind of broader group of developers who've traditionally worked more in the higher poverty areas now looking for ways to do both housing development and preservation in higher opportunity areas and also in areas that are gentrifying. And so that's a whole new source of energy and capital, in a sense, that we're seeing come in. I think that's going to be a good model for the future.
Yeah, and I think that brings us to something else we were going to talk about, which is the role of the private sector in building affordable housing, which can then encourage mobility. And I think after the Supreme Court decision, which inclusive communities challenged the way the state of Texas assigned credits for low-income housing tax credit properties, now the state can put more points or award more points for developments in higher opportunity areas. So I wanted to ask Carol a little bit about what you think that will change, how that will change where private developers are building, and just generally kind of what are some of the barriers for private developers in building affordable units in high opportunity areas.
So I would start by saying I think the Supreme, Demetria may agree or disagree with me on this, but I think the Supreme Court decision basically will help facilitate states looking at their qualified allocation plans and what they give points for and how that works. The Supreme Court decision didn't say you can't, put a low-income housing tax credit project in a high poverty neighborhood. It said that there are times when that is a legitimate undertaking for the state to want to promote that policy, and so those can and I think will continue. I think, though, or what I would hope is that there'll be more nuanced policies around when you are putting tax credit development in a high poverty neighborhood, what is the context in which you're doing that? Is it a community revitalization plan? Is it a choice neighborhoods grant? Is it preserving, and I know there's going to be another panel on this, but is it preserving existing affordable housing in a gentrifying neighborhood that you want to be sure that those folks don't get displaced as the neighborhood gets better? So I think states should take this decision and should look at their qualified allocation plans and be much more nuanced about how they give points for community revitalization and how they give points for, I wouldn't even call it mobility. I like what California came up with a while ago. I don't know why they dropped it, which is this balanced communities point system. So I think those are a number of things that could happen as a result of the Supreme Court decision. And I think, to Phil's point, many nonprofit and community developer type organizations have been building in low poverty neighborhoods and will continue to do that. But I think this is a really good conversation to ensure that the state allocating agencies, are also looking at this in a balanced way. Because at the end of the day, the developers are going to chase the money, right? Like they can't make the project work unless they can get these sources of money. So they're going to go where those point systems drive them.
I think that the case is still pending, so I'll say that much. But it's important to note that following trial, there was a plan put in place. And I mentioned earlier there are about 3 tax credit projects that had come online in the last 3 years. Trial was in 2011. And that made it clear, and it just as a side note, it wasn't just about the QAP because the agency was also using its discretion to pull up projects that didn't score very well. And the 4% program doesn't use points. But we've seen developers come out and actually develop. We had one in Frisco that came online. We had one in the town of Sunnyvale that came online. We have 2 in McKinney. All of these are in high opportunity areas, and that these started coming online before the Supreme Court made its ruling. So it is possible to do, and I think that kind of goes to your point.
And Carol, can you talk a little bit about what types of units are being built or can be used for housing in kind of higher opportunity areas?
Sure. Well, I think we've been talking a lot about rental housing, and we've been talking a lot about multifamily housing, probably implicitly and not explicitly. And I think those are, great opportunities. I do have a slide I want to show, if you could pull that up. I wanted to show this slide because what it shows is from 2006 to 2014, all growth in occupied housing units have been in rentals, but a very significant portion of that has been in single-family home rentals. And so part of what I wanted to highlight here is I think there's an opportunity that is not being fully utilized for the mobility conversation and needs some additional strategies and some additional tools to, maybe make this more effective. And I know that vouchers are used in single-family homes, but probably not nearly as much as they could be with some additional changes, either to, say, the tax credit program to enable scattered site, single-family tax credit developments in many of these rental homes. I think there are going to be a number of them continuing to come on the market and finding ways of, creating single-family rental homes that actually have some financing attached to them in a way that make them more affordable using state, local, and federal funding sources, I think is a huge potential that we haven't begun to really get at. And then the other thing I would add on to that is you've also got an ability there to maybe start to create some wealth building by doing some lease to own and getting people, back into the home ownership realm, which has definitely gone down in these past, recessionary years. So I don't have all the answers. I've got some ideas about how to make this happen, but I think it's a big piece of the puzzle that we haven't tackled that helps on the mobility side. And by the way, something like 68% of the housing stock is single-family detached homes, and it's not going anywhere. So, we got to figure out a way to use it better.
But I think that it raises interesting questions because I remember maybe 5 years ago I went to Hemet, which is in the Inland Empire in California, and there are these gated communities that were now being used for housing vouchers because they had been, a lot of people had lost them to foreclosures during the housing crisis. If you look around, that maybe at one point had been an area of opportunity, and I think no longer was an area of opportunity. So I'm wondering if you can maybe talk about, Carol, how do we determine what is an area of opportunity and where? I mean, we don't want to be telling people where they should move, right? But we also don't want to spend resources assisting people to move to areas that are actually going to they're going to have worse outcomes there.
So I think this is a huge question, and I'll take a crack at it, but I'd love other people to take a crack at it too, because defining what is an area of opportunity, I think really does change over time, and it's one of the challenges that I'm concerned about with the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, because you're using static data, and at least, I live in the Oakland, California area, which is now the 5th most expensive rental market in the country. And it wasn't even on the map 5 years ago. 68% rent increases in the past, cumulative over the past 3 years. These are places that are changing so rapidly that, most people wouldn't have thought of most neighborhoods in Oakland where minorities live to be areas of opportunity. But it's certainly changing. So I don't really have an answer, except that I think that we need to be sure that we're being timely and nuanced in defining what's opportunity area. And, back to the research, places with good schools and good access to transportation to get to and from schools and from jobs, I think those should be, high on the list in my mind of places that are considered opportunity neighborhoods.
It was when it was 2007. I mentioned that we got started in 2005, working with Walker Settlement voucher holders, and their location outcomes were defined by the court, right? I mentioned earlier some of the factors that the court created when they considered what that would be. And we had a focus group of clients that talked about various neighborhoods that were considered Walker target areas. They're like, what? That neighborhood? No way, you're kidding me. I'll stay away from there, no way. And that's when we realized it was 2007, that 2000 data was simply old. And that's when we created our own definition of what we considered high opportunity using area median income, poverty, and education data. So that's absolutely correct.
So school data, median income data. What else did you use?
Well, and the school data is, right now we're using the Texas Education Agency tells you what schools have, passed, let's say. And also we're looking at 4-year high school graduation rates as well.
I know in a lot of areas we've talked about inclusionary zoning a little bit, but I'm wondering if anyone feels comfortable talking about this, ways, if there are areas of high opportunity that don't want affordable housing developments, that don't want voucher holders in their neighborhoods, are there ways to push back against this either legally or in other ways?
Well, the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule is in part designed to force those discussions in those exclusionary communities and to, it's not a fair share requirement like Carol was discussing, but it's why is our community so segregated and what can we do about it? That's the basic discussion that the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule requires. How to deal with exclusionary zoning in a state that does not have a zoning override rule, and I think only 5 or 6 states have that now. That's a really tough question because as we learned in a couple of the states we've worked in, developers tend to shy away from towns that are going to put up a zoning fight. They don't even make the proposal. The deterrence is really significant. So, aside from setting up a lawsuit against a town like that to open it up, as has happened in Long Island and other places, I think it's going to be tough in those areas. I think the two key things in those really exclusionary communities are housing vouchers, which don't require any municipal involvement of any kind. It's the family and the landlord doing a lease, and the town has no jurisdiction over that in any way, unless you're in St. Louis County, Missouri, in which case you have to get a permit to live in the town, but that's a whole different. So the voucher program can kind of override that local exclusionary approach. And the other approach is housing acquisition. And Carol talked about single-family housing. You can also use housing acquisition to acquire smaller garden apartments and things like that. And we were so impressed going out last year to King County and the King County Housing Authority and the strides they've made over 15 years in acquiring what they call Class B apartment buildings, small apartment complexes in these really high-end school districts east of Lake Washington, where they basically they exist as workforce housing, kind of on the cusp of being bought out by some developer and turned into luxury housing, but it's workforce housing. They buy it, they manage it as workforce housing, and over time they sort of move a few Section 8 project-based vouchers from their wait list, those families into those units. Families with young kids who are now going to some of the best school districts in the state of Washington. So that kind of acquisition strategy, for which HUD currently has no tool available, the next administration needs to think about a tool to permit this to happen in more places. That kind of acquisition strategy requires no municipal involvement at all. It's just an as-of-right purchase.
Yep, Barbara?
So for the non-housing people in the room particularly, I just want to put this conversation a little in perspective.
Come on.
It's my role to be a translator. There are a lot of places where you need to develop more housing for rent in order to enable lower income people to live there with a voucher or otherwise in terms of access to high opportunity. And there are places where even though there is an adequate supply of rental housing in higher opportunity areas, landlords don't want to work with the voucher program. But it doesn't make sense to me, and I don't think it's necessary, that there has to be kind of a acceptance of those limitations and a belief that you just have to work around them and get properties acquired by more willing landlords, et cetera. Housing authorities and their partners who care about these issues really need to do, I think, a much more aggressive job of marketing, of selling the voucher program, of selling the benefits of the voucher program, of overcoming what is often, deeply outdated misunderstandings about how the voucher program works. Sometimes it is a question of improving the management of a local voucher program so that inspections are quick and payments are timely and accurate so that any landlord would be wanting to deal with them. And sometimes this is all a cover for racial discrimination, which is already illegal and just needs a much more aggressive level of local enforcement. So I'm not trying to say that this issue is simple, but the genius of the voucher program is, as Phil said, that no community has to vote to let somebody move in. All you need to do is find a willing landlord. And there have been periods of time where in various communities there has been a much more aggressive creative effort to market the voucher program. And I think one of the really unfortunate side effects of the funding roller coaster that Congress has subjected local housing agencies to is that they've been too understandably focused on just how to keep the ship afloat and not, if you'll excuse the metaphor, how to sail up new channels. But hopefully we can, maybe we will be in a period of more stability going forward. Because this is the core operation of housing authorities. This is what they are supposed to be doing, is selling their program to the community. And I think it can be done without a whole lot of money, without new laws. I mean, this is the easy thing to do.
I think if we could just
focus on it.
Even just find out, how many housing authorities are taking a laissez-faire approach and how many are actually trying to recruit landlords, which is what our counselors do. And negotiating rents and landlord bonuses. How many housing authorities are actually trying to recruit landlords?
So I believe the answer was when HUD did a study of the administrative functions of well-managed housing authorities last year or the year before, that something like 1.4% of total time was spent on landlord outreach. So that needs to change.
Well, I do want to make sure we have time for questions. So if you do have a question, please go to one of the microphones. There's one in the back there, and there's one up here. And in the meantime, I want you guys to think about if you had an unending pot of money, what do you think the most effective way to encourage mobility would be? We can talk about that at the end. So, yep, over here.
Hi, I'm Rolf Pendahl from the Urban Institute, and thanks everybody for being here today. It's a great day, and thanks to the folks at CBPP for putting this material in front of us and getting us here. I'd like the panel to talk a little bit about cars. This summer, HUD Cityscape published 2 articles by Evelyn Blumenberg, Casey Dawkins, and Jay Joan, who's now an intern at CBPP, so great catch, and me, showing that moving to opportunity and welfare to work voucher users who had cars lived in neighborhoods that had higher general quality, lower poverty rates, lower crime rates. The families felt safer, and they were more satisfied in those neighborhoods. Evie's research also showed that they were more likely to get jobs and keep them, and they had higher wages. So I'm kind of wondering if you can talk about, in Dallas, you got to have a car if you want to succeed and get an apartment in these kinds of neighborhoods. How can we bring automobility into the conversation about residential mobility? Thanks.
And should we, I think?
I'm from Texas, so that latter part of what you just said doesn't really resonate in Texas. I tell you, and people are always talking about, what about people with cars? You can't have people move out. If you go to the hood in Dallas, you will see more shade tree auto mechanics than you will in a high opportunity neighborhood. Everybody's got a car. It might not be the best car in the world, might be hoopty, transmission might fall out in a couple of weeks, but they have cars. And if you don't, then you don't make the choice to make the move. But I think it's really important to highlight what went on in Baltimore. I don't know if it's still going on now, but my Baltimore friends can correct me, but I believe the ABLE Foundation provided some support as far as transportation assistance for some of the voucher families who were interested in moving, and I think it played a significant role. We haven't had that type of foundation support where we are, but the families that tend to move in the high opportunity areas are the families who have automobiles. So it tends to be the more elderly families who are really the ones who are without kids oftentimes, and the ones who have more health challenges and who are more interested in the social networking piece. But the young families with kids tend to be the ones that have cars who make these kind of moves.
So I, as the Californian on the other end of the world, I was going to make a smart aleck comment that we're all going to have driverless cars very soon if Google has anything to say about it in the next 5 years. But I do think that in California this is a big issue because the funding for housing, we talk about funding through tax credits and mobility. In California, the big driver of funding is the new cap and trade dollars that require that in order to get points, you have to show that your development is reducing greenhouse gas effects, which means less driving and automobiles and projects that are not in far-flung suburbs where people need to drive. So this is something that we are really struggling with in California relative to the car society versus trying to change the overall car society at the same time that people still need cars to get to various places. So I don't have the answer except that when most of the developers are doing developments, they are doing the equivalent of Zipcar and all of that kind of thing with access of the residents to a pool of cars that are available to them. That's one of the ways that people are trying to get around that problem.
Just to put it in context, too, the jobs are in the suburban areas in the Dallas area. The jobs are not in the inner city. So if you're moving out to the suburban area, you're actually moving closer to the jobs.
And I think in a lot of cities, high opportunity is often, or sometimes now, more in the urban centers, or there are high opportunity areas in the urban centers. Back there?
Michael Bodak and National Housing Trust, and I want to make one point, and then I want to return to one of Phil's comments when I want to endorse it. So I recommend or commend to people's reading a blog put out by the Urban Institute a week or two ago in which the Urban Institute looked at the expiring tax credit units in the United States over the next 2 years. And interestingly and notably, a majority of those expiring Section 8 units, I should say, 400,000 units, are in low poverty neighborhoods. And that's contrary to some conventional wisdom, but it's important to note that those units are at risk. They are in low poverty neighborhoods, and we have to keep our eye on the ball. And it leads me to Phil's point, which is, I think, fundamental. We talk a lot about building new housing in high opportunity areas and the barriers to do that. And it is absolutely the case that that's difficult. And Carol, you have the scars to show it. The Trust is working in 4 cities with fair housing advocates in which we're trying to preserve existing market rate housing near good schools. We're in Chicago, Baltimore. Aaron Boggs is here with us from Connecticut, and Adam Gordon in New Jersey. And the idea is to try to buy market rate housing and slowly introduce up to 15 or 20% vouchers in that market rate housing near good schools. Now, it's not easy to do. We just got outbid by $1.5 million near a high-performing school in Chicago. But to Phil's fundamental point, it's not just building, it's also trying to figure out ways to think creatively outside of the government to try to preserve existing market rate opportunities near good schools or high opportunity, however you want to define it. It's not easy. I'm not suggesting it's easy, but I think we want to do this. We preserve housing both in distressed neighborhoods and in high opportunity neighborhoods. We're very close by to a property, 84 units that we bought on our street between 14th and 15th, which is gentrification central here in DC. But I do think Phil's onto something, and I encourage people to think both new construction and preservation in thinking about high opportunity.
Well, let me just make that into a question, which was something that we didn't quite talk about, but how to preserve affordable housing in areas that are gentrifying and becoming high poverty. I mean, is this community land trusts, or is it acquisition, which, you know, in gentrifying neighborhoods is going to be very expensive? Are there solutions that anyone wants to talk about preserving affordable housing in those kind of neighborhoods?
So I agree that buying market rate buildings is a great idea. I think one needs to be a little bit careful at the peak of the cycle. And I would suggest you're at the peak of the cycle in Washington, D.C. on rental housing at the moment. So be careful how much you pay for that property, or you may be underwater tomorrow. So maybe it was good you got outbid on that particular one. But I do think that acquisition, particularly around transit hubs, that kind of thing, is really important. And at least in the Bay Area, they created something called the TOA, the Transit Affordable Opportunity Fund or something, to enable nonprofits to actually purchase properties near transit areas that are becoming gentrified.
I really wanted to flag another aspect of this question that is challenging, but I want to put it out there, which is opportunity areas generally cost more, whether it's for the acquisition, for the rent. Now, we think that on balance, you can afford that in the voucher program if you also have a policy that stops overpaying for units in high poverty neighborhoods. But really, if a lot of people wanted to move to high opportunity areas, the cost curve would start going up. And so in a fiscally constrained time, it's really important to be thinking of how do you have acquisition and long-term affordability strategies that actually can also deliver on lowering the costs in the housing voucher program for renting those units. And there are ways of doing it, but you have to do it intentionally. So I won't bore people with all the mechanisms, but I think it's important to flag that.
Phil, did you want to add something?
Well, I forgot what I was going to add, but I'm going to have to just, if we're going to get into a deep conversation about costs and benefits, we'll need to do more PowerPoints and have a whole separate panel. But, I think, we're all committed to balance, and people in fair housing have been saying we need a balanced policy for a long time. And I think it's wonderful that we're finally getting to the point where everyone's agreeing that we need balance in development in high opportunity areas and poor neighborhoods. But just in terms of the cost effectiveness, we're talking about, in the case of the voucher program, a $3,200 investment per family on top of the voucher to get families into a community that has all the attributes that we associate with opportunity. To make that same investment per family in the existing community, to get all those opportunities there, the per family cost of that is going to be astronomical. It's not that we shouldn't do that, we should do both, and I think that's very important. But the assumption that it's more expensive to develop opportunity housing for families in opportunity areas, first of all, the per unit construction cost, I'm not so sure that it's less in the urban center. But it's more expensive. But putting that aside, if you look at the entire cost of what you're trying to deliver to the family in terms of the school quality and everything else, I think there's really no question which is more cost effective. It's not to say we shouldn't have balance in our housing policy, but Barbara's looking at this solely from the perspective of the HUD budget. And I think that we have to look a little bit bigger in terms of cost and benefits.
Well, I also want to be able to afford more vouchers. I just think that the benefit and the weakness of the voucher program is that it's a market-based program, and the market rises in high opportunity areas. And I think it is important to be thinking about nonprofit owners who are mission-driven, who will accept more operating cost-based rents rather than market-based rents, and things like that enable you to do more of what, this isn't an either-or, Phil, it's how do you afford to do more?
Well, I want to make sure we have a chance to get to all the questioners. So no one else go up in line. Everyone is up, you'll get to ask a question. And if you keep your question short, and we'll try to keep the answers short also.
Yeah, Doug Ryan, Corporation for Enterprise Development, CFED. A couple different points that people have touched on, but I'd like the panel to respond to. One thing is, of course, one way to free up more rentals is to make more first-time home buyers. And we are at a 28-year low for first-time home buyers. It was just released by the National Association of Realtors. That should be a concern for lots of different reasons, for building wealth in the communities and other things. So that's something we need to think about. Typically, people who are first-time home buyers are moving out of rental units. So there's that. And so we have to, part of the policy discussion should be thinking about home ownership differently. We need to fully embrace, Alana, you talked about community land trusts, but in a home ownership model as well. Limited equity cooperatives, shared equity models. There's lots of ways of doing things that aren't fully embraced across the country for various reasons, for ideological as well as statutory reasons. We need to think about that. On the other side of getting more vouchers out there and getting more landlords to accept them, I can tell you this, having worked in Montgomery County, Maryland, the housing authority there, where there is a source of income protection, one of only 3 jurisdictions in the state of Maryland, a very liberal blue state, I had the honor and the thrill of testifying before state legislators who were completely unwilling to make that law statewide, and these were people that you would expect to be allies of this cause. I could tell you many are unwilling to cross the industry, the lobbying industry for that part of the world, and that's a very difficult conversation to have with that, with that in mind. That said, there may be an opportunity in the next 60 to 90 days to talk about this. As everyone in the room knows, that Congress mandated in 2008 a duty to serve for Fannie and Freddie. FHFA, their regulators, about to release the duty to serve re-proposed rules this month, we believe, including the requirement they have manufactured housing and rural housing requirements, but there's also a housing preservation requirement. Perhaps comments could include a requirement or an encouragement of Fannie and Freddie to have a voucher requirement or some sort of component in the duty to serve preservation model to advance this conversation forward.
Okay, we'll go back there for question unless anyone has a burning response to that. No. Okay, go ahead.
Great. Hi, Erica Pothig from the Urban Institute. Thanks again for this great conversation. So Raj mentioned earlier that networks are an important component of what we think may be delivering on some of the benefits. And low-income people really rely on their networks for childcare, for transportation, and other kinds of supports. So I'm curious what the panel thinks about how we can be facilitating or are protecting people from the disruption of those important networks if they are moving to a neighborhood of opportunity, and the extent to which losing that network may be impeding people's choice to move to opportunity. Barbara knows I have this idea of a buddy voucher, and I'm just curious if there's a mechanism by which you think we could enable people to be moving together so that they don't lose that important support.
Go ahead.
I don't have an answer to the question, but I think it's really important for us to not assume that a family's network is a positive one. We have clients who are running to get away from their family members. Of course, that's not the majority of everybody, but it certainly is something that families have said when we've made some home visits, and they were happy to be away from certain family members. And I was struck by a comment at my table during lunch about how a lot of families from high poverty neighborhoods don't necessarily have those networks because they're churning, I believe the word was, that they're making multiple moves within high poverty neighborhoods, that they too are families who don't necessarily start out before a high opportunity move with a social network that is positive that they'd like to keep in place. The idea of a buddy voucher is new to me, so I can't comment on that. But we do find families and connect them with their new neighborhoods. We let them know about things that are going on. We connect them with the schools before the school year started if they moved during the summertime. So there are new networks that are to be made. And I think a family who is that tied to the previous network is the family that doesn't make the move.
Right. Right, and I think when you bring these programs to scale, I mean, I love the idea of a buddy voucher. I've always loved that idea, Erica. But I think when you bring the programs to scale, you also have other families who you may even know who are coming from the same program who are in the neighborhood, and you might bump into them at the supermarket. So, it's not the image that these families are isolated in these communities. If we're bringing these to scale, there'll be a small percentage of folks in the community, but there's a critical mass also.
And I know, Demetria, didn't talk about this, but they also do counseling after people move to make sure they're kind of connected to new networks as well. Okay, last question.
Great. Good afternoon, Adrian Todman, Director of the DC Housing Authority. I'd like to thank the Center for this extraordinary day. It feels empowered to have so many friends and ambassadors for the programs that we run, really smart people all in one room, so thank you. I had a comment and then a question. So the comment is, I assume this is a fairly local crowd, so just in terms of keeping up, we've had to raise the value of our vouchers here in DC from 100% of FMRs to 130% just to stay in neighborhoods that were considered emerging 5 years ago. So there is a cost implication that is beyond the security deposit. There's a cost of just keeping up with rent. So I wanted to share that to them. This is, if you live in DC, that's staying in Shaw, staying in Brookline, staying in Trinidad. I mean, we've had to raise our rents, and that comes with a cost of housing another family. So that's just one local perspective. The other is I didn't hear enough about ways that we can encourage opportunity in neighborhoods that need it still. I'll give you an example. We have a Greenleaf site. Again, this is a local crowd. If you're down M Street, headed toward National Stadium, we have one of our largest public housing sites that's just to the left, and we try to keep it as tight as we can. We were denied a HUD grant because the schools are too good and the neighborhood actually wasn't poor enough. So under the heading of preserving affordable housing, this is 300 units that I can preserve, but I won't say which grant program it was, but we were denied a grant because the statistics...
We can guess.
Yeah. The statistics around it wouldn't allow me to access the capital funds I needed to really help that neighborhood be preserved in years to come in what is clearly an already gentrified neighborhood. So I'm intrigued about brilliant thoughts you might have on ways we can kind of reverse our investment in areas that are already gentrifying where there's affordable housing.
I think it's tough, but I do think I'm just going to go back to a comment I made earlier, which is, we are often operating either looking backwards or with data that is old, and I think we all, HUD people creating these policies, certainly Congress and all of us can fall victim to not keeping up with the trends that are happening on the ground in places. And I think you're raising a real concern about how we look at a lot of different HUD and tax credit programs, which is these programs are not effective right now in dealing with rapidly changing demographics and income situations and rental prices in this country. They're just not built appropriately.
I actually think the problem goes beyond that. I think that's true, but it's also the case that we don't have, at least on the HUD side, programs that are targeted at preservation of affordable housing in already low-poverty neighborhoods. It isn't just a question of the rapidly changing. You have data that show you it's low poverty, and that means you don't qualify for a Choice Neighborhoods grant. We, at the center, had urged HUD in the Rules for the Rental Assistance Demonstration to prioritize public housing properties in low-poverty neighborhoods, because that was a program that didn't come with all the bells and whistles of Choice Neighborhoods to transform a neighborhood. And we thought it would make sense to prioritize the properties that are already in good neighborhoods if only they could remain livable. And that got ignored. But I think that this conversation is part of changing the whole paradigm about an anti-poverty strategy is not just about focusing on poor neighborhoods, though we're going to talk about that in the next panel. It is also about preserving affordable housing and in low-poverty neighborhoods, as well as helping people with vouchers move to those neighborhoods. And we don't kind of have those programs on the preservation side now. So
Yep. So we're unfortunately out of time. Lots of things to think about and talk about. According to my program, we have until 3:15, at which point we'll reconvene for the next panel. So thank you all to the wonderful panelists, and we'll be back in about 10 minutes.